I have to say that I am kind of concerned about diversity. I think that we're much more diverse on our campuses um, than we once were. Um, but I am concerned about access and the cost of coming to a college or university and having that experience. And I'm also talking about the experience. I'm wondering, what that experience is actually like. I went to college in what I considered, and as I consider it now, a really nurturing kind of experience, and one where I felt like I was supported regardless of who I was and what I believed in. I felt like I was a member of a community and people supported me. They may not have agreed with me on everything, but nonetheless, I felt supported. Do we have that anymore?
All right. Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Heather Shea. Today is truly a special treat for me as I get to interview one of my student affairs mentors and heroes, Dr. Paul Shang. We're going to dig into his long career, his leadership of ACPA, and all the lessons that he has learned working in student affairs. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We hope you'll find these conversations make a contribution to the field and are restorative to the profession. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays, and you can find us at studentaffairsnow.com. Today's episode is sponsored by Simplicity. A true partner, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life with technology platforms that empower institutions to make data-driven decisions. This episode is also brought to you by Stylus. Visit Stylus Pub and use the promo code SANOW for 30% off and free shipping. Stay tuned to the end of the podcast for more information about each sponsor. As I mentioned, I am your host for today's episode, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am broadcasting from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, otherwise known as East Lansing, Michigan, home to Michigan State University, where I work. The university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. So let's get on to this conversation. I am so excited to have Paul with us today on Student Affairs Now. Welcome, Paul.
Hello, Heather. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm so glad to spend some time with you. Paul, you and I have known each other for almost 25 years, maybe even
Yes.
right at 25 years. I know, but I'll tell our audience that you have played such an instrumental role in my career, encouraging me from a very early age to pursue a PhD, to consider running for ACPA President. And so I'm just really grateful for an opportunity to say thank you today, but also to just highlight all of the things you've done beyond inspire Heather Shea in this field. So thank you for spending a little bit of time. We're going to start actually by you telling us a little bit about what you've done over your career. You have served in various roles across many campuses in all corners of the United States. You have also, as I mentioned, been ACPA President. And I'd love to hear a little bit about just how you got to those roles, and then we'll talk a bit about how you've seen student affairs work evolve over time. You are a true legend. So I'll let you kick us off.
Well, thank you for being so gracious, Heather, and for also always being such a wonderful colleague and a delightful person to work with. I actually came to student affairs in a kind of a circuitous route, if you will. I was a PhD student at Florida State University and began as a freshman there in 1969 and graduated in 78 with my PhD. Now, I had a double major as an undergraduate in political science and philosophy because I love both those fields. And you have to remember what the times were like then. It was the Vietnam War. I think there was a great deal of student activism. Florida State was a very nurturing and wonderful experience, especially for me, because I grew up as basically in rural Florida in the middle of the state. And so going off to a university was just a wonderful, wonderful, life-changing, expansive experience that I would wish upon everybody. But anyway, because of my background in philosophy, I really enjoy thinking about things kind of in a larger way and maybe a more historical way. Political sciences had always encouraged me to think about the way people interacted with one another and made decisions together. So I received a letter as I was finishing my dissertation from the American Philosophical Association. It's sort of miraculous, but it was one of those mimeographed letters. You could still pick it up and smell it. And, I don't know that anybody knows mimeograph technology anymore, but yes. And that the American Philosophical Association could keep track of all of us graduate students across the country was miraculous. But anyway, the letter said, it was gracious, but it basically said, we want you to finish your PhD, but there are no jobs. And so, and there weren't. It was the emergence of the more professional kind of oriented academic programs and the decline of the beginning of the decline of the liberal arts, if you will. And so this is the only advantage of having taken all of your degrees, and I have 4 of them from Florida State. And they knew who I was. They took care of me as an undergraduate student when I was off to go ahead and start protesting one thing or another. I actually did have faculty, as I was crossing the campus, reach out to me and say, if you get in trouble, give me a call. And we didn't have email back then. We just we gave each other our phone numbers. Yeah. And of course, invariably, I did get into trouble because it was the 60s and you had to go out and do important things. And it was that kind of an environment. So I was approached by people in student affairs who said that they really didn't care for my values that much, but they liked the way that I led my peers and tried to keep them out of trouble and tried to minimize damage to the university. And if I'd get my hair cut, they'd give me a job. So that's how it all started. And it was in the very first minority affairs office in the South and definitely in Florida. And it was called actually Office of Minority Affairs, which was kind of an interesting name back then, but it's totally acceptable. And now, of course, we would change it and try to make it not quite that pejorative now. But it was my introduction to working with students on a one-to-one kind of level, and also I learned about financial aid. I learned about admissions. I learned about all the different things that student affairs people learn about, in masters and their EDD or PhD programs. And I learned it through experience. And I learned it working with people of color, specifically African-American students or Black students. And that was my tradition, actually. It went from Florida State to Iowa, where I met Ursula Delworth, a significant member in our profession, was a significant, very prominent member of our profession, and also my current spouse, Laura Macagno Shang. And they took me to an ACPA convention. I had been part of all of those TRIO programs and the TRIO-oriented kinds of professional groups. And this is the first time. And this was in Chicago, ironically. And it was the joint ACPA-NASPA convention many years ago. And they took me there. And it was such a mind-expanding experience for me in the sense of beginning to understand that, there was a lot of us in student affairs and we all did different things, but there were things that brought us together. And ultimately, it was our experience with students that made these activities and these conventions and these ways of thinking so very, very important. So I hope that was brief enough, and I hope that was, interesting in some degree. But yes, that's
Absolutely.
how I got into student affairs.
That's a great story. So after Iowa, when did you end up at Colorado State, which is where our paths crossed?
I was basically at Iowa for about 7 years,
Okay.
and I uh, I was encouraged to start thinking about um, doing some other kinds of work within student affairs. And I met through Ursula, I met Donna McKinley,
Mm,
um, a, a wonderful student affairs VP or associate VP at that time. And she wanted to create an academic advising center on campus. And the academic advising center also was going to be very significant in terms of doing student orientation.
mm,
So I applied and luckily was able to get the job and stayed at Colorado State for 15 years
mhm.
and totally enjoyed it. I had a wonderful experience there, met you and other delightful students through our Student Affairs in Higher Education master's degree program.
Mm.
Um, and that was very important for me and my professional and personal development in the sense that I continue to get to interact with students on a one-to-one kind of scale, as well as have more important, administrative sort of responsibilities.
Mhm.
And
Well,
then, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I think one of the really unique things about Colorado State SAHI program is the fact that you have folks who are full-time administrators and directors of units and departments who are mentoring, advising, and even teaching in the program. And that, I think that's for, if anything affected me more, it was the ability to learn from people who are doing this work as part of their practice. How did you get into teaching, or how did that end up happening? How did you end up becoming an advisor and connecting with master's students?
Well, I wanted to have that experience, and I volunteered with the Student Affairs and Higher Education program. And because of my background, I was also paired with somebody and to teach student development theory.
Mm,
And I think I taught with Ann Hudgens for several years that particular course and really enjoyed it. But it was the ability to work with students at the master's level
mhm,
um, and to talk with them about what they might be doing, as they continued in the profession was really very important experience for me. And hopefully the students benefited from that to a certain extent. But it was just such a marvelous experience to be able to work with people who were very talented, saw things particularly and possibly in different ways. I grew a lot from that experience. But I also wanted to make sure that people understood, the significance of advanced education and on the master's and also the PhD level, because it is just a fabulous experience, and I enjoyed it greatly, and I wanted my students, people I advise, to understand that you go on and there are other things that you can do beyond the master's degree.
mhm. Well, I remember sitting in your office and thinking about, I don't remember all the different opportunities that you could do, as you could write a professional paper, or you could write a thesis, or you could do something else. But I remember you encouraging me to do research, right? And then that was going to be an opportunity for me to kind of learn a little bit about what that scholarly pursuit was like. And so I did endeavor and ended up doing a qualitative study of multiracial students. And I remember sitting in your office and having lots of really heady conversations about what is race and how are we defining race? And then what does it mean to be a white person studying multiraciality? How is that going to influence like my logger career? And then I remember you saying to me at some point, well, what else has been written about this? And I think we dug into the card catalog at that point in time. I don't even know if there were some electronic files maybe, but Kristen Wren, there was one published higher ed focused paper on multiracial college students, and it was by Kristen Wren, who fast forward for those of you who don't know me, was my dissertation chair here at Michigan State. And and later you and I met Chris, and we're like, oh my gosh, she's one of those people, I think, who had an impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So I did talk to another one of your advisees because I was really curious about how other people experienced you. My good friend Jennifer Hamilton
Yes.
graduated in '97 from the SAHI program, so she's even, I think, a little bit before me. And she said as I reflect on Paul as an advisor, I just recall his genuine interest in students and his supportive cheerleader role. And then even years after I graduated, must have had buckets of those interactions with tons of folks. And yet he showed genuine interest in me as a professional. And that kind of encouragement and support has been so valuable. So Jen wanted to know, where does that energy come from, and how do you go about cultivating such a genuine care and interest in students and in others?
Well, that's very nice of Jennifer to have responded the way that she did. You get this kind of once in a lifetime opportunity to meet people and to appreciate them and to learn about them and to get some sense of their potential. And that's in many respects for me what higher education is all about. I think things have changed and a little bit in that maybe we don't have the same time or opportunities anymore to interact that closely with students. But that was something that I really enjoyed, and it's an energizing kind of experience. There are lots of things that you do with groups and groups of students, and large lectures and demonstrations and so forth. But the one-to-one interactions where you genuinely get to know somebody and to understand what they're going to be like one day or get a glimpse into that is so important and so energizing. And what I really enjoyed about my interactions with students, especially at Colorado State, in the SAHI program.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more just about how you've seen student affairs work evolve over time, and maybe a little bit about how you evolved as a student affairs educator over time?
Well, I think that, and this is maybe possibly the downside of getting more professional responsibilities. Is that frequently it kind of ends up taking you further away from, individual students. And you start thinking about students in group ways, and sometimes that's a positive thing and sometimes that's not. And I think that things have changed really dramatically, at least for me, as I became a dean of students, in the sense that there wasn't the same one-on-one interaction unless it was under very special circumstances. And many of those are very positive, and sometimes they're not so positive. But I think what has happened is that over time, and possibly because of technology, and possibly because of the way that our society and also our universities have changed, and the challenges that we're all confronted with now, it's become, for me anyway, it became less personal in the sense of less interaction with individuals and less of an ability to actually kind of care about them. When you think about people in terms of groups, it just blurs everything. At least that was my experience. And so designing things and thinking about changes that you might make on behalf of groups or recommend to be implemented to a group of people is just not the same if you don't have those individual experiences that help you think it through and what is this going to actually be like for the person that is the participant. And so there are lots of interesting discussions and debates that went on in my time. For instance, the whole concern about fraternities and sororities and the relationship of fraternities and sororities and different things like alcohol and other substance abuse, like sexual assault, and instances perhaps of racism. All of that was something that, those were important considerations, but ultimately, what I would do is go ahead and try to have dinners with fraternities and sororities and meet them and talk to them about the significance that they play, the roles that they play, and also understand why they belong to those groups. And it's another way of being a student. It's another, at least then for me, that's what I learned. And it's another way to have a group. And so it was sort of an important way to get some experience and to understand those particular organizations and to realize that, well, this is an experience and quite possibly an important experience for the development of those individual students. And we need to be even-handed about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's little pockets of belonging, but it seems like there's sometimes like a lot of intergroup conflict among fraternity and sorority chapters. At least for me, at least, I'm always telling the sororities from my current vantage point. I'm like, together, you are the largest women's organization on campus. Like, you could really move the needle around some gender equity issues, and so helping students kind of see their power too, I think, is something that's challenging.
Right. And they were the source in my day anyway of most of the student leaders on campus and student government and elsewhere. I like that term, little pockets of belonging. Yeah. That's kind of cool. It's really neat.
or big pocket, depends on the size of campus, right? Where you have like 150 students. Yeah. I am really curious. So you mentioned in your intro that you have this PhD in philosophy from Florida State, and that's a less traditional preparation program, right? I think you're unique in that background. Can you talk about like how that's shaped your view of student affairs work, and maybe what in what ways do you draw upon that body of knowledge through your career?
Well, I think it introduced me into a discipline where, in the sense of trying to think and look at things, more thoughtfully. And possibly, you may have noticed in your experience with me, it may take me a while to actually tell you what I think. And that's possibly because I'm just kind of not real clear about what I'm thinking until I've been able to sit down and really work it through in my mind. And that's, I think it's a plus and it's a minus. These days we're asked to respond pretty quickly to things, and I don't know that we get the opportunity to really be as thoughtful about them as we would like. But philosophy kind of gave me that patience and that desire to go ahead and let's think this thing through and try to understand it from a multitude of different perspectives. Philosophers never win arguments. they always just try to raise the consciousness about a topic just a little bit. The other thing, though, is it really automatically kind of gave me an appreciation for student development theory
Mm,
and
mhm.
the importance of looking at the student experience and describing it and writing it about it and sharing it with others and trying to understand, what it is about universities and higher education and how can students be served better and how is it that they benefit from these experiences. And so that was something that I appreciated about my background, even though it took me a lot of catching up to try to become more familiar with the literature.
Yeah. Well, I think we could all use a philosophy, because it's sometimes like, why am I doing this work? Like those big why questions. I think
Right,
philosophy might have some answers for us, or more questions, right? Like one of the things that I value is like thinking about things is important.
right,
Um,
right.
so, you ended up serving as ACPA president. I think I read 2002 to 2003. Is that the correct year
I
span?
think so.
Okay. So that's exactly 20 years ago. Um, and as you know, I'm moving into that role at this next
Yes.
convention. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what it was like to lead the association 20 years ago, and then any advice you have for me as I'm moving into this role.
Wow. Well, it was an entirely different time
Hmm.
20 years ago, and the association was organized in somewhat different ways. And I am so looking forward to your convention, and I'm going to be there. And Jennifer Hamilton out there in the world, I want you to know that I'm looking forward to meeting you there. And we'll have to get
Chicago.
together and talk and maybe have lunch or something together and just commiserate and also celebrate all that we've been through. But it, I guess my advice, let me skip to that part first
Hmm.
before I
Sure.
describe, the background a little bit. Is I think it's really important to be a good listener and but also to share a lot about yourself. I think that people in ACPA, especially the newer members, want to know, what their leaders are like and how it is people who become presidents of ACPA, what they did to get there. And I think that you've been very prominent in the profession in many, many different ways. So I think maybe you might not necessarily have to do the same kind of things that some of us did because we were probably a lot more limited in our presence in the
Student Affairs
profession.
Now has definitely helped in that regard, I feel like.
I'm sure it has.
Yeah,
I'm sure it has.
yeah.
So that would be probably the sole piece of advice because when I was president, it was very clear that we needed to make sure that the organization was on a firm financial and administrative basis. We had just not that long ago separated from a larger organization. And we wanted to make sure that we continued to be the largest student affairs professional association at that time in the country, and also one that continued to focus on those things that our association felt was important, and that was diversity and being accessible to newer members of the profession, to be a good place for newer members of the profession, to also expand the notion of what it meant to be in student affairs and reach out to our colleagues in community colleges and elsewhere, and maintain a stable and strong relationship with faculty, so that we saw ourselves as a big community celebrating our profession.
Mhm.
And at that time, the Minnesota Student Affairs Association, the regional association, was very, very strong. So it was great having my convention there, and they largely were the planners of the
Mm,
convention.
mm.
Um, Nowadays, I think it's a little different. I think it's much more inclusive in that people can volunteer to be on the planning committees, and so they come from everywhere. And I think that that's a very obviously it's been a very, very positive approach, and one that's been successful, because I've heard that the meetings are great. But what we were able to do was to go ahead and build on a group of people that were already there. And so we limited travel expenses and those kinds of things by doing that. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
the other piece of experience or suggestion I have for you is to enjoy it. I mean, you hear people talk about being in these very significant roles and just saying, "Oh, I'm so glad it's over." You know, it was such a drain on my time, blah blah. But the fact of the matter is that I loved it, and I know that you will too,
Yeah.
because it's such an opportunity to give back in many respects.
Yeah. Yeah, the association has given me so much. I'm really humbled and grateful for the opportunity. And I really think that we're at this really interesting point in our history too, right? The convention in Chicago will be the 100th
Yes.
anniversary of ACPA, which is an exciting milestone. And so, yeah, I have no doubt I'm gonna really enjoy it, and I have a lot of respect for all of the people who have served in the president role over time, because in this year as vice president, I've gotten a bit of an insight into the amount of work that it entails. But I'm very excited. It's going to be great.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So
it's 3 years
yes,
of
it truly is.
significant effort. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So I'm curious, through that time period, I mean, I know for me at least, ACPA has kind of been this professional, through line, as I've moved around the country and as I've taken different roles in different institutions. And my colleagues and communities of support have really been largely centered on that professional association. But can you talk a little bit about who your communities of support, who were your mentors, and how have you kind of maintained relationships over time with them?
Well, I was very privileged to have had quite a few mentors actually.
Mm,
And of course, the one group that other than ACPA, which has been very significant for me, is a group called Valhalla, which um, is a group of past ACPA presidents, and also people who published and contributed significantly to the profession. And we used to, before COVID, have these wonderful meetings that would last a long weekend,
mm,
and get away and be able to talk. But you know, I like that little pockets of belonging, and I'm going to
mm.
try to incorporate that
Yeah.
into my way of thinking. At ACPA affords you an opportunity to do a lot of that. You meet people, and you make arrangements to be able to form into groups, either at the convention or elsewhere. Um, I always encouraged people and thought it was very important to have folks not at your own campus that
Mm,
you can talk to. Um, ACPA was a wonderful place for that. Your local professional association would be a good place for it probably, and just a group of peers that are committed and that you have good relationships with, just getting together and sharing
mhm,
everything there is to share about your experience. You know, the student affairs has got its really positive aspects, and then there are really challenging aspects too. And you've got to be able to get all of that out there with somebody, people that you trust and are not going to violate any confidences or anything like that. And I think that's very hard to do on your own campus. So create these peer groups wherever you are, and be able to have an outlet, because as I've said, I think I've said repeatedly, there are really good things about the profession and the experience, and then there are some that are not so good. And I have to say that my hat's off to you, Heather, and also my other colleagues at Michigan State for how you've dealt with and continue to deal with, what has happened on your campus, and for all the other people out there on campuses and high schools and elementary schools and all the places where these tragedies have been occurring.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much I'm feeling for you and trying to share your grief.
Thank you. Yeah, Paul, you were one of the people who texted me that night. Watching the news, are you okay? And I mentioned on a previous episode of the podcast, like how valuable those outreaches are, right? I mean, it shows that we have a very large, interconnected and caring community of educators across the country. And so I really appreciate that. And I think I texted you, I'm headed to campus, and you're like, good job. Keep going.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Absolutely.
rough.
And
Well,
keep going even now.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. I mean, it's been a couple of weeks, but it's still pretty present.
Right.
And even though news media has gone on and the stories aren't right, but like our campus is still kind of in the midst of what does it mean to have a tragedy like this. So, so I know your last professional role was as the Dean of Students at the University of Oregon before you retired. How many years ago did you retire? It feels like yesterday, but
no, it was quite a few years ago. I think it was like 2015. So
okay.
I've been, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe a little later than that. Time flies.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I know. Well, and I think you and I have talked a little bit about, I mean, I've always thought of the Dean of Students position as kind of the quintessential student affairs role, right? Like our field, student affairs, was founded through kind of the deans of women and deans of men and the places where students came for support, right? And so I always thought like the Dean of Students is like my career aspiration. And then I remember talking with you about this, right? And that role has really evolved and become more complicated. And I'd love to hear any kind of particular observations you want to share about that after being retired.
Well, I think you'd be a wonderful dean of students, and I think you'd be a wonderful vice president for student affairs and a wonderful president of a university if you
Thank you.
to be one.
Biggest cheerleader, right?
Yeah, but I think you have all the skills and I think the personality, and I think that student affairs professionals need to think about these leadership responsibilities and new roles and bringing new perspectives to their campuses. I think the role has changed significantly, but I also think that it's an important role. To me, it's the bridge. It's the one that where people are able to kind of perhaps see different perspectives is through the dean of students. That's the positive aspect. That's also the biggest challenge, especially in times like this where it seems as if people are much more divisive and perhaps much less able to listen to one another than perhaps they once were. Maybe contentious is a better word. I don't know. But as I talk with my friends and as I read the literature that's coming out, it seems that the mood on campus and the environment on campus is becoming more and more reflective of our society in general, which I think is a huge challenge. So that's what I would like to encourage people to think about it as they undertake these additional responsibilities is, how are you going to cope with maybe more contentiousness, less willingness to learn from one another, and how are you going to be able to maintain your own values and your own perspectives? How much personal work do you have to do before you achieve these kinds of responsibilities? Your own identity, where the lines are that you're just not going to cross, and also how you're going to interact, I think, with more diverse perspectives that probably are less willing than they have been before to learn with one another. I practiced with millennials for the most part. And if you read, and what, they are 2 generations of college students ago now, that was a group that was a much more optimistic group of people, and perhaps as students, they had more confidence about the impact that they were going to make on the world, and of course, on themselves. So that's the kind of thing that I think is going to be very important for people to be thoughtful about, is how you're going to interact. And what I perceive, and maybe it's not true, and I'm hoping it's not, but it appears to be a more contentious environment.
Yeah.
And having said that, let me go ahead and say that I would encourage people who are entering into the profession and entering into significant leadership responsibilities at different institutions to understand how those institutions are managed, understand how decisions are made, and really understand unions and tenure, and what kind of things. I wouldn't have said this years ago when I was entering the profession, but now I would really not be obsessed by the idea, but I would understand, how am I going to be able to be as effective as I can be? Because a student affairs professional, I think, has the obligation to be an educator and to say to everybody, this is what's the better thing for students. And there's students who probably object to your perspectives, and there are probably others on your campus who might object to those perspectives. But I think that's the role that a student affairs, especially a dean of students, has to be able to articulate, to successfully demonstrate, is the ability to say, well, ultimately, what's best for the students, I think, might be this, as opposed to what we're talking about now.
Right. Yeah. And it's been, I think you're really hitting it, that like there is a lot of contentiousness among groups and a lot of polarization among various factions. And so, how can administrators kind of serve in a restorative way to build bridges? And I like that the dean of students role kind of has some of that in their responsibility. So you've been retired since 2015. What have you been doing in your retirement? I know you were doing CrossFit for a little bit before COVID, or some other kind of gym-based fitness thing, but I understand you just traveled to Mexico. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
Well, that's basically what I've been up to. I haven't been, when I worked, I wasn't able to do all the exercise that I probably should have done. I always tried to do a little something, but I think that now that I've been able to do it much more seriously and much more consistently, I would encourage people who are working to have an exercise regimen that they're faithful with, because it's really important, and it contributes a lot to your perspective on the world. It's interesting when people retire, oftentimes folks think that they're just going to have so much time on their hands. Well, that just hasn't been our experience, to be perfectly honest. We've traveled, and we've certainly done more things in terms of our immediate community off of campus. And we're involved in Rotary, and we do other kinds of voluntary work to try to improve our communities or to assist people that are in our communities. So I've had fun. I like to travel, and also I've been to Mexico twice now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And through Rotary, we work with an organization called Project Amigo, and their function is to educate people who would ordinarily be impoverished, possibly, or live in migrant camps. These are people who do the agricultural work within Mexico itself. They move back and forth from different areas, and oftentimes their children aren't able to go to school. And so Project Amigo has come up with this way of educating students in this one area, and through the really different kinds of experiences they've created for folks like Laura and me and other Rotarians and other people who just want to volunteer, they've been able to create a viable nonprofit organization that has seen students from preschool all the way through the university and into law school and architectural school and beyond. And it's been the last activity that we were involved in was teaching English or enhancing English speaking skills to university students. And these were already students who were pretty good, but it was very intense and very enjoyable. But it's continued to be, that was a way to contribute and to be part of something that had a large or significant impact on those communities. Because if people are able to continue their education and they are able to find jobs and work in Mexico, why would they think about leaving? And that's the kind of impact that Project Amigo has had, and an important one. And it's been one that's very beneficial to everybody who's involved in it.
That's great. That is great. I can just see you and Laura just really taking all of that to heart and increasing your impact, right, beyond just the community that you're in, but really thinking about it internationally. We're getting close to the end of our time together, but I'd love to hear in your final thoughts just any advice that you have for new professionals, and maybe a little bit about what you would have wanted to tell yourself, as like having a long career in student affairs. And then we'll get to our traditional final question, which is always about what we're pondering. But what advice would you give to a new professional?
Well, I guess the advice that I would give is probably something that's kind of obvious. But on the other hand, I really mean this sincerely, in the sense that you're going to have an experience that's your experience, and you have to be true to yourself, but also you have to give yourself the opportunity to learn and grow from it. It's a wonderful experience, and you meet wonderful peers along the way, but always you have to understand that this is it. This is your experience, and you need to be genuine and honest about it, and especially as it relates to you personally and individually, and your family too, because all of it's one of those things that happens not just to you, but to a group of people together. So I'd be thoughtful about that, and I would really try to enjoy it for all it is. At the same time, being real honest with yourself about how it's impacting you, and how you're serving your students in your college, your community, your campus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So our podcast, as you know, is called Student Affairs Now. So I'd love to hear if there's things that this conversation has brought up that you're pondering or questioning or excited about, or things that you're just generally thinking about in the world that you want to share. Just whatever final thoughts you want to add.
Well, I came into student affairs. I came into higher education, period, with the whole idealistic notion, which I'm sticking to, that as Dewey has argued, and Jefferson has argued, and many other philosophers and educators have argued, education is kind of the basis of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a building block, it's a foundation. You have to have an educated electorate, especially these days when the questions are so complicated. So I remain committed to that idea. But at the same time, I have to say that I am kind of concerned about diversity. I think that we're much more diverse on our campuses than we once were. But I am concerned about access and the cost of coming to a college or university and having that experience. And I'm also talking about the experience. I'm wondering, what that experience is actually like. I went to college in what I considered, and as I consider it now, a really nurturing kind of experience, and one where I felt like I was supported regardless of who I was and what I believed in. I felt like I was a member of a community and people supported me. They may not have agreed with me on everything, but nonetheless, I felt supported. Do we have that anymore? Is it that same sort of experience? And can we have that again at places like Florida State, Michigan State, and Oregon, and Colorado State, and big schools, larger schools? Can we have those sorts of important, nurturing experiences like I was really fortunate to enjoy?
I think that's a great note to leave us on, and I absolutely agree with you. And I think our society needs education even more now, and we've always needed it. But I think that we do have this imperative. I'm excited to put this episode out into the world, and for those folks who have not met Paul before, have a little bit of an opportunity to spend some time with you and learn from you, Paul, as I have done over a couple of decades. So yeah, thank you
It's
so
been
much.
wonderful, a
It has been
wonderful
wonderful.
experience. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful for your time serving, not only as my mentor, but also just being able to be vulnerable and willing to share your journey with us here today. So closing, we typically then talk a bit about our sponsors. So let me tell you a little bit about that. We have two sponsors today. Simplicity is the global leader in student services technology platforms with state-of-the-art technology that empowers institutions to make data-driven decisions specific to their goals. A true partner to the institution, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life, including but not limited to career services and development, student conduct and well-being, student success and accessibility services. And you can learn more by visiting simplicity.com. And our second sponsor is Stylus. Stylus is proud to be a sponsor for Student Affairs Now. Browse their student affairs, diversity, and professional development titles at styluspub.com. And you can use promo code SANOW for 30% off all books plus free shipping. And if you visit our website, you can learn more about our sponsors by clicking there. Thanks to Nat Ambrosi, our dedicated behind the scenes producer who does all of the great work to make us look and sound good. And if you're listening today and not already receiving our weekly newsletter, please visit our website and add your email address. We send out a weekly newsletter, and you can also check out our archives. Thanks to everybody for listening and watching today. Again, my name is Heather Shea, and I hope you make it a great week.